I guess this will work. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. Hi. All right, so I'm pretty happy to be speaking here today on the topic of mainstreaming BDS and connecting struggles because as long as I've been in the movement, that's the core of what I've been interested in doing. And one of the reasons I care so much about the Palestinian issue is because I located within the struggle for the liberation of all colonized or formerly colonized peoples. And so from indigenous Americans who were labeled savages, to African Americans who were labeled subhuman, to any number of migrant groups who have been an internal threat to the security of the state at any point in history, to the migrants who we label illegal after going in and bombarding their countries and all those sorts of things. The rhetoric and the actions that we see around Palestine are things that have happened to so many people throughout history. And yeah, none of our groups knows what self-determination or liberation or justice quite means. And so for me, it's by fighting to ensure that these goals are met for Palestinians that we can advance the struggles of many of these other groups around the world whose oppression has been so deeply entrenched and normalized for much longer than the Palestinian struggle. So on a material level, the very focused and systematic oppression of Palestinians as a flashpoint for experiences of control, surveillance, and dispossession that so many people around the world experience. As we've already heard, just look to the border wall along stolen colonized land in Palestine and its connection to the border wall along stolen colonized land just miles south of us here in San Diego. You can also look to G4S, which as we know operates Israeli prisons, transferring Palestinians illegally across borders, detaining them indefinitely, torturing them. But G4S also operates the largest private prison in South Africa, where inmates have also been abused. It operates asylum seeker detention facilities in the United Kingdom, where people have died under restraint from G4S employees. It protects oil refineries and gas companies in the Niger Delta, where pollution is severely harming the health of local populations. It protects the mining companies in the Philippines that exploit indigenous lands and peoples. It operates private youth detention facilities in the United States and United Kingdom. The list goes on and on. And so what is important for us to note is, and understand, is that while the current largest call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions comes from Palestinian civil society, these tactics are not specific to the Palestinian issue, and the companies that many of our BDS campaigns target do not only oppress Palestinians. So here we must raise the question, what should it look like for us to respond to the Palestinian call and fulfill our mandate as Palestine Solidarity organizers, while also working with other movements and issues affected by political and economic policies of racism and exploitation? And here we must continue the conversation that Professor Abdul Hadi started last night about de-exceptionalizing Palestine, de-exceptionalizing Israel, de-exceptionalizing the United States. One of the first steps in doing that is recognizing that Israel is no more of a racist state, its policies no more in violation of human rights than our own country against its black, indigenous, and non-white people. Our own state has yet to rectify the central injustices to its founding, whether that be the colonization of indigenous land and genocide against indigenous people, or the enslavement and dehumanization of Africans and later African Americans that continues to this day. And our empire, I might add, would not be possible without either of these two fundamental, foundational acts of oppression. So we might look to the US as an example of what happens when the world normalizes racism and colonialism. And as we work to present as we work to resist the normalization of Israeli occupation, we must also be working to denormalize our own systematic and internalized racist and colonial policies. And so the call for BDS offers a great model for how to center the primary oppressions of Israeli occupation in mainstream conversations. We in the US might look to the call for BDS as a model for addressing the antagonisms in our own society. And while we know that we cannot compromise until the occupation ends, until the refugees have come home or received compensation, and until full legal equality exists for all people in historic Palestine, Uncompromising success for Palestinians represents the chance forward for other movements whose full rights have already been compromised. For African Americans who have legal rights on paper, a man in the White House whose legal rights are eroded day after day, and who exist at the hands of the injustice system where slavery remains constitutional as a punishment for a crime. Or whether it's for Hawaiians whose sovereign kingdom remains illegally occupied by this country, or for other indigenous people and nations across this land who have experienced genocide whose justice comes in the form of reservations. And as I said, for migrants whose homelands have been ravaged by our country's economic, political, and diplomatic policies. So this work of joint struggle does not contradict or dilute the work we are doing as Palestine Solidarity organizers. In fact, it strengthens it. And this is the core tenet of joint struggle, a concept that we discussed at the conclusion of Students for Justice in Palestine National Conference at Stanford last year. And this is also a concept that we're highlighting at our upcoming conference at Tufts next month. So I just want to take a moment to give you a few points from a slide that the Palestine Youth Movement, Malcolm X Grassroots Network, and International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network put together for this panel last year of what joint struggle is and of what it isn't. So joint struggle strengthens all of our movements and doesn't compromise the needs or goals of another. It's organized from specific locations within different movements and not on behalf of the movement. So it would be inappropriate maybe for this movement to, without consultation of other groups, start to organize on their behalf. Joint struggle is specific to the needs and issues and histories of the communities involved, and it builds unity. It isn't generalized or exceptionalized. So the generalizing tendency would be to say, oh, like all black and brown people in the US and around the world experience the same oppression, it's racism, which we can talk about in Q&A, but we experience different types of repression. And the opposite of that is what we've already been talking about, is to exceptionalize the struggle as so different than anything else. Joint struggle works out the power dynamics between communities and works to build sustainable relationships rather than replaying those power dynamics. So as I was saying, all of our communities have their own specific histories of oppression that might even come from other communities under struggle. And so in pursuing joint struggle, we have to be cognizant of those histories. Joint struggle is fighting for self-determination and liberation. It's not just focusing on the acquisition of rights or access or privileges. Which is one of the, I think, larger misunderstandings of the Black freedom struggle, which we tend to look at as having ended with the civil rights movement, whereas we still live in a society where Black people don't know what justice or liberation looks like. Joint struggle organizes locally, but also has an international perspective and relationships. So it wouldn't work to, it needs to have, as I said, a local and a grassroots focus, but also to be looking to build relationships transnationally. One of the more important things to note is, and I think this is something we understand as Palestine Solidarity organizers, is the importance of not compromising the short term for the sake of our long-term success of the movement. So within divestment campaigns at campuses, for example, other groups might be hesitant to co-sponsor events with SJPs because Palestine is an untouchable topic. But as we seek to build other movements, we have to remember that we shouldn't be expedient for our own movement, but should be seeking to do the hard work and the long-term work of really working to empower everybody. And from that, it's a hard process. It's not easy. It's not something that just happens. Like, oh, hey, you're oppressed. We're oppressed, like, let's do this together. It requires a lot more intentional relationship building. And I guess the last thing I'll leave from this list, which I hope to share with the conference sometime soon, is that it's our duty and it's our responsibility to pursue joint struggle, but it's not something that comes out of seeking favor or guilting communities into support. So what I just said, that it's not as simple as sharing a history of oppression. You need to do a lot more work behind that. So the biggest thing to take away from this list is that solidarity is not something to be expected or assumed. It is something that is given out of a sense of linked fate and a demonstrated commitment to co-resistance. Within campuses, there's a lot of potential for BDS work around Palestine to link up with groups addressing mass incarceration and the privatization of prisons, and with groups seeking to resist the militarization and privatization of the border, among other issues. At Stanford, we learned this last spring when our SJP chapter decided to broaden the scope of a G4S divestment campaign that we were directing against our commencement speakers this year, Bill and Melinda Gates, whose foundation has millions of dollars of shares in G4S, among many other ethical companies. We recognize that G4S harms many communities, or pretty much every community around the world. And so we decided it would be a good flashpoint on campus to highlight issues that all students and activists care about, to bring together and strengthen working coalitions between our groups by uniting around an action rather than sort of like theoretical, hypothetical discussions about the importance of joint struggle. And the goal is to leave a legacy for the next generation of campus activists. What we found was students were very interested in engaging from all across campus, and the campaign brought together students from communities that didn't necessarily interact outside of that. And together with the work of Admir and other transnational organizations, we were successful in getting the Gates Foundation to divest from G4S. A useful case study for a movement at large. We're at a pivotal moment right now in connecting with other movements across the nation, and as we're starting to have conversations about more intentional structure and coordination within this movement, and after almost 10 years of BDS work, we may be in a position to raise up other movements that are interested in pursuing similar tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. But we are also in a big position to learn from other movements. To learn from the folks here in San Diego and Tucson and other border towns about the work they're doing. To learn from folks in Detroit or Ferguson, which are the flashpoints for resistance against centuries of anti-Black policies in this country. So as I conclude and as we move on to hearing more about joint struggle in Ferguson right now, it is crucial for us to remember that the crises of this summer in Gaza and Ferguson, none of that oppression was new. It was just an exacerbated version of policies and practices that have been going on for decades, if not centuries. And these policies were foundational to the state that we live in, as well as foundational to the state whose policies of occupation, dispossession, and discrimination we seek to end. But the moments of transnational solidarity and consciousness raising between Ferguson and Palestine were nothing short of inspiring to me. In it, we saw the seeds for a resurgent national movement that shows that Black Lives Matter, and actually making that something that is evident in the practices of this country. But we also saw the seeds of a resurgent transnational movement to work for the respect of all humans around the world. And we had this for a time, I think in the 60s and 50s and 70s around the decolonial movement, but for various reasons that are related to these tactics of repression we've already spoken about. I think we have a lot of work to do to build back to that point, but I do definitely think it's possible. So the path ahead of us will be very difficult, but I'm confident in the ability of everyday people to overcome these struggles, and I'm also confident in the ability of our movement to figure out how we can best contribute to that practice. Thank you for your time.